Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Paul Ainsley. I'm a City of Toronto councillor for Ward 24 here in southeast corner of Toronto, and also on the board of the directors of the Ontario Good Roads Association. It's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. I hope everybody had a very enjoyable lunch, got some time to visit some of the exhibitors in the hall if you haven't yet. Lots of interesting exhibitors, lots to show. I hope you can find some time to get into the exhibit hall. It's my pleasure this afternoon as well. I'm here to introduce Minister Monty McNaughton. Monty is a three-term MPP from Lambton, Kent, Middlesex. Minister McNaughton grew up in Newbury in southwestern Ontario, learned the value of hard work and community service by working in his family business. By the time he was 20, Minister McNaughton was elected as a Newbury councillor, was subsequently re-elected two more times. Minister McNaughton is a graduate of the Westerville Business College and the Richard Ivey School of Business at Western Ontario. Mr. McNaughton was sworn in last spring as Ontario's Minister of Infrastructure. Minister McNaughton and his wife Kate have a daughter Annie and live in Mount Bridges, Ontario. It's my pleasure to ask everybody to join me in welcoming Minister McNaughton, our Minister of Infrastructure, and for the province of Ontario.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul, for that kind introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many friendly faces and familiar faces in the crowd today. I'm honored to be here to bring greetings on behalf of Premier Ford and our government at Queen's Park. I want to just take one moment to single out someone who, a friend of mine, someone who has worked very hard for this organization, Chris Trainey. Chris, I know you must be around here somewhere. Chris, thank you so much for everything that you've done and the advice that you've given me along the way. Chris and I have had the opportunity to work together since I was sworn in as minister on asset management planning. And I want to thank him again for his leadership on that file. It's always good to have a chance to talk about infrastructure. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to talk about my priorities going forward as Minister of Infrastructure. Infrastructure benefits for the people. We're going to talk this afternoon about roads and bridges, broadband, and natural gas expansion. As Paul said, I cut my teeth in municipal politics, serving 3 terms as a councillor in the village of Newbury in rural southwestern Ontario. It gave me a ground-level education on the importance of infrastructure planning. But the truth is, I don't need people to tell me what good roads mean to people. In my neck of the woods, we're drivers. People from towns like mine, where I live now, Mount Bridges, spend a lot of time on the road. We know. And now, living part-time in Toronto, I've gotten to learn about the other side of the coin, which is commuter life. I know that a good ride on transit gets me home to my family sooner, and I'm always happy when I get to spend more time with my family. Infrastructure is like that. We tend to talk about bricks, mortar, and aggregate, and project costs that are so high, the numbers don't make sense to many people. But I like to talk about it in terms of people. Who is this project helping, and how is it helping them? Myself and my staff ask these questions every time we look at a new project. I know that sometimes these discussions get really interesting. In fact, I was in Wellesley, Ontario in November, celebrating the opening of bridge number 0026. My team planned the trip for me. I was responsible for bringing the warm clothing. A quick word of advice, if you're ever going to a bridge opening in Wellesley, Ontario in November, make sure that you pack warm clothing. When we got to the ribbon cutting, I started talking to people. The first person I met was a local resident. She was beaming. I still remember her name. Her name was Denise. Denise told me the bridge is part of her and her husband's daily commute. The old bridge wasn't wide enough for 2 full-size cars. If another vehicle was coming toward them, they had to pull over. For Denise, every trip across the bridge was nerve-wracking, and that wasn't a good feeling. The new bridge changed all of that. It's a full-size bridge that now easily fits 2 vehicles. Denise was beaming because this bridge meant so much to her and her family. It meant that she felt safe. And that feeling is worth more than all of the bricks, mortar, and billion-dollar projects in the world. That captures the way I see infrastructure. It's not about the thing being built, it's about making people's lives better. Similarly, our government puts people at the center of everything that we do. People are the reason we're at Queen's Park. They are our first and last thought in every decision. As a part of that commitment, our priority is to create and protect good jobs. There is a strong connection with infrastructure here. We know that smart transportation infrastructure brings businesses and jobs to Ontario. The Toronto Region Board of Trade recently tied GTA gridlock to manufacturing shutdowns. The report said delays cost between $500 million and $650 million every year. That drives up prices for goods across Canada. Our economy is stronger when we keep people and goods moving, and this keeps more money in people's pockets. That's why our government is committed to providing predictable, secure infrastructure funding to address provincial and local priorities. Our government-funded programs will, of course, include infrastructure investments. Jointly funded programs, like Investing in Canada Infrastructure, will benefit communities across the province. As you are aware, Ontario and the federal government signed an integrated bilateral agreement for $11.8 billion. And by the way, I know that many of you are keen to hear an update about the status of the Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund and the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. I can tell you that we anticipate launching application intakes for the rural and northern stream and the public transit stream in the very near future. This means investments in roads and bridges. It's important stuff, and I'm really excited to tell you more about it in the near future. This will be followed by the community, culture, and recreation stream and the green stream. This sequencing will allow time to engage communities on their infrastructure priorities. It will also help manage communities' financial capacity to contribute to their portion of these cost-sharing programs. Just as our spending must be well sequenced, it must also be smart and targeted. We must make the right investments at the right place and in the right time. We want to get the most out of the infrastructure that we have. This is true whether we're talking about small projects or large ones. We are committed to getting maximum value for taxpayers. Getting the most out of the infrastructure means balancing investments in new assets with investments in rehabilitation. We need to take advantage of every opportunity to maximize these assets before new projects are built. That's why we're working closely with municipalities on asset management program. Officials from my ministry will be presenting on this topic during the conference, and I encourage you to attend this session. Good asset management planning will help our government and our municipal partners like you prioritize investments to be as efficient as possible. Work is ongoing to improve the data on our provincial infrastructure assets. This helps us understand our current requirements. If we can project the capacity and demand for assets we have now, we can better predict what we need in the future. These are the kinds of positive changes we want to make in Ontario's communities, both big and small. When it comes to the larger infrastructure projects in Ontario, our government believes in the private sector's ability to deliver them efficiently. Ontario's project pipeline is amongst the most active in the world. Our agency, Infrastructure Ontario, currently has 25 projects worth $18.4 billion under construction. Another 12 projects worth nearly $7 billion are currently in the planning stage. By working strategically with the private sector on major projects, we can help grow our economy and create jobs. Collectively, this is yet another example that Ontario is open for jobs. Evidence from around the world shows P3 projects are on time and on budget more often. A group at Western University studied this issue and came to a pretty decisive conclusion. They said the P3s are superior to traditional project delivery because they help guard against delays and cost overruns. But that doesn't mean that P3s in Ontario can't be done better. We want to learn from other experiences around the world. That's why I recently introduced a market sounding initiative. We want to know how we can increase competition and attract interest from global market participants. In Ontario, we have entered a period of competing fiscal resources. Our government has committed to balancing the budget in a responsible, sustainable way. We'll do that while protecting health, education, and other services people hold dear. This means where we do spend, we will spend smartly. I believe there is an opportunity to increase the productivity of our infrastructure, and I'm not alone in that thinking. According to a report by McKinsey, there are ways to create more and better infrastructure for less. Best practices from around the world, like eliminating waste, improving how projects are selected, streamlining delivery, would get more out of the assets that we have. The numbers are actually mind-boggling. The report suggests efficiencies could allow global infrastructure spending to be cut by 40%, saving countries around the world nearly $1 trillion annually. During this period of competing fiscal priorities in Ontario, we must make smart investment decisions. Those decisions must benefit the people. For example, we know that broadband and cellular connectivity are essential to economic growth and job creation. Most residents in Ontario have access to the internet, but speed and quality vary significantly across the province. There is a clear rural-urban divide. I'm from a small rural town. I know about the service gaps firsthand, like many of you in this room do. In fact, just on Friday, I was in my riding making an announcement. It was actually probably the most important announcement in my career at Queen's Park. I was sharing news that a local hospital would receive badly needed funding. Unfortunately, the broadband in Wallaceburg, Ontario, where I made the infrastructure announcement, isn't as good as a broadband in Toronto. People trying to watch the live stream from home got a pretty choppy feed. Now, some of you may argue that a blurry and choppy feed when I was speaking is a good thing, but there were some that actually wanted to watch the announcement. The fact is, people in rural regions have fewer service providers to choose from. They pay much higher costs and get lower speeds than people in high-density urban areas. Our government is committed to ensuring that more people get access to better service. It'll allow communities and businesses to fully participate in the digital economy. In the coming months, we will release a broadband and cellular plan. This includes an action plan to expand broadband and cellular access right across the province. So stay tuned. Finally, I'd like to tell you about our efforts to increase people's access to natural gas in rural and remote parts of Ontario. Last fall, we passed the Access to Natural Gas Act. This will help expand natural gas access to more parts of rural and northern Ontario, including First Nations communities. For the average Ontario consumer, switching to natural gas would save them between $800 and $2,500 every year. I don't need to tell you that's a lot of money for many people in the province. The Ontario Energy Board is now assisting in developing this new program. We expect to have details in the coming months. We know this type of investment makes businesses more competitive and boosts our economy. Most importantly, it puts more money back into the pockets of hardworking Ontarians. Some of you may be aware, but I've been in a marathon session of briefings this morning, and I know I met many of you in the room, but I just want to say it was a great chance for me to hear firsthand the needs and concerns of your municipalities and your regions in this province. I learned about your successes and challenges, and it really helps us in identifying the priorities that I laid out today. So it's been great to share those ideas and share what's on our government's agenda over the next number of weeks and coming months, and I look forward to working with all of you as we deliver effective and efficient infrastructure for the people of this province. Thank you very much.
name's Stephen Kadama. I'm the Director of Transportation for the City of Toronto and the OGRA Board Director. Recently, the Mohawk Center launched a series of reports that take a close look at the data from the 2016 census to chart the most important trends and discuss their implications for policymakers. Many of the census results, such as those related to aging and diversity, have been widely reported. But a closer look at the data reveals both trends have been overlooked and important nuances that merit more attention for policymakers and the public. Today, we are fortunate to have a director of the Mohawk Center, Andrew Parkin, joining us. Andrew is an associate professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Policy at the University of Toronto. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andrew Parkin.
Hi. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for all the work that you do. So my challenge today is to talk to you a little bit about a number of themes that you'll be familiar with, but to try and at least put a little different spin on it or give you a little bit of a fresh angle to some of what we talk about. We talk about how the population of the province is changing, talk about things like immigration and income and so on. So I'm going to do my best to do that. The folks should really get the timer going here because I could talk about this all afternoon and nobody wants that. So I'm going to look at that timer, and right now that timer tells me I've got all the time in the world, which is excellent for me. There, they started it. I knew that would work. Okay, so I'm going to go through some basic population trends. Then, as I said, some information about income, some about immigration, and at the end, I'm hoping I have a little bit of time to talk about some different data that we have, which is public opinion data from across the province, which just gives a little bit of a different insight into what's going on. So the first thing I'm going to show, the first couple slides I've got are, trust me, it gets better. This is the least interesting thing I'm going to say. The most obvious thing to everyone. We know from the census that the province is growing, but that growth is uneven across the province. We often think of Toronto as the big metropolis, the booming city, but as many of you will know, it's not really the center of growth in the province. The center of growth is the area around Toronto, the 905 area. Toronto is just kind of growing at the average rate. And then some of the other regions about the province a little less, and there actually in the last 5 years was a bit of a drop in population in the northeast of the province. For most of the presentation, I'll just look at instead of looking at sort of big census regions, I'll just divide the province up by size of population. So you can see the growth rates here again over the last 5 years. And it basically just goes from high to low as you get to smaller communities, with those outliers at the end, about which I know very little, but essentially a lot of people like moving to Collingwood, apparently. So in some couple very small communities up on Georgian Bay and so on, they're skewing the growth rates of those, but of course it's a relatively small number of people. Okay, so we know that growth is distributed uneven across the province. In order to really understand kind of what's behind that and why it's important for us to know that, let's just break it down a little bit by age. So this is growth rates by age group. And the key thing that you'll notice here is there's only one sort of cluster of communities in the province where we're adding children, right? And that is in the largest communities. It's basically Ottawa, Hamilton, Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, and Toronto, right? Where you're adding children. Everywhere else in the province, year by year, there are fewer children than there used to be. Right? And this is important when we talk about the aging society. We're always talking about the aging society. There's this tsunami coming of the aging society, and it's all going to change everything we do, and that's absolutely correct. But it doesn't mean the same thing in every community. So in Toronto, the aging society means that a lot of people are living longer, right? So you've got children, and you've got people in the workforce, and you've got retired people, and those people are hanging around longer, which is wonderful. We get to spend more time with them, and one day I'll be there myself, right? So you have to provide services and so on to deal with that. But in other parts of the province, what it means is that the whole population is shifting. So you have fewer younger people, and you're left with just a growing community of older people. And that's a very, very different set of challenges that you have. I mean, to put it in its crudest sense, in Toronto, you have to build schools and you have to build hospitals. And in the rest of the province, and increasingly in the smaller and smaller communities, you have to close schools and build hospitals. And that's a different kinds of governance and management challenge. Again, just to look at, I think I'll just break it down by community size here. So this is showing us two things. Again, in those big cities, right, you've still got that blue bar is your proportion of children. So you've still got more children in your society than people over the age of 65. But everywhere else in the province, you've got more people over 65 than children. And you can see, again, the smaller and smaller community you get, the more that skews. And of course, what that affects is how many people in the population each working person has to support. So that's what the dependency ratio is, right? That's the number of either children or seniors who are not yet or no longer in the workforce that a working person has to support, right? And the smaller community that you have, the more of those dependent people each worker is trying to support. And that leads us to this, and this is one of my two favorite slides in the presentation because I think this kind of drives it home, right? So on average in Ontario, for every person who's just about getting to retirement age, you have a person coming out of adolescence, right? So essentially you've got 96 adolescents for every person who's like around 64, 65. Not quite in balance, but not really that dramatic, right? So you're going to keep a relatively stable, slightly shrinking labor force. In those four biggest cities, it's 108, so you've got more of those young people coming into your labor force than you have people exiting. But you can see again, as you go across from larger communities to small, that ratio starts to decrease. So when you're in those communities under 100,000 people, right, for every 100 people that are leaving your workforce, you only have 72 that are ready to come in. And in those very small towns, that ratio reaches 68. So keeping this in mind when you're thinking again about that aging population of seniors, it's not just that there are more seniors, but who's there in your communities to support them, to provide the services that they may need, and so on, right? So that's the real, I think, dilemma of the aging society. And I'll get back to this a little bit when we talk a bit more about immigration. I'm going to switch to income then, and I realize it's a very busy chart with a lot of numbers, and I'll move on and show some charts that are a bit easier to get a handle on. I think the main thing you need to know here is there's a lot of red, okay? So this is income changes in real terms, so in fact, getting inflation out of the picture over 10 years, in different census metropolitan areas in the province of Ontario by gender, and I threw in by type of income, but I'm going to focus on employment income, how much you earn from your job. Right? And as I said, particularly for men, you can see that there's a lot of red there, meaning a lot of negative numbers. So that the income that people were earning in 2015 was actually lower than the income that they are earning in 2005. Now, I need to be really clear here. This doesn't track individuals. So it's not literally that someone's income fell, but it's just if you took a slice of the population in 2015 and a slice in 2005, right, the income was actually falling. For those of you who kind of follow the issues around gender wage gaps and so on, one of the fascinating, maybe not fascinating, troubling things here is the census reported that the income gap between men and women was narrowing in Ontario, and that's obviously a good thing, but it was narrowing largely because men's income was falling, right? Which is not really the strategy I think that we want to follow in order to get to gender parity. But let me kind of show this in a more simplified form. So now I'm just looking at men, employment income, the change over 10 years. And again, you can see that it was negative almost everywhere, but then of course not uniform, much more pronounced. And here you can really kind of map out an arc around Toronto, so starting from the east in Oshawa, going up to Barrie, and then all the way down to the southwest, all the way down to Windsor, right? And you can also picture where manufacturing jobs might have been distributed across the province during this time, right? And so you can just see how much more pronounced the income losses were, particularly when you get to St. Catharines and Windsor and so on. But the next element that I want to get into here is just how that falls out by age, and I'm still separating it by gender here. So we're looking at men, and now I'm going to look at different age groups. So if you look at the slice for Ontario there, you can see the green bars as the youngest age group in Corey working age, 25 to 34. And that's where the employment income losses was most pronounced. So again, I want to be clear, doesn't mean that individual in that age group lost income over that time. It just means if you look at 25 to 34-year-olds in 2015, they were earning less than 25 to 34-year-olds in 2005. Right? And I think this, and again, more pronounced if you pick certain communities in the province, and you can see that we're below the national trend there. And I think this is important when there's a lot of talk about millennials these days, and are they snowflakes? And if they only knew how hard we had it when we were young, then they would realize they didn't really have much to complain about and so on. But you can see here that there are issues going on with the current young generation as they try and establish themselves in the workforce, try and start a family, buy a house, and so on. Right? There are conditions that have changed over the last 10 years in the province that can make that a bigger issue. There's some parts of our report, if you want to check it out, that I won't get into here. I don't have any slides on it. But underneath all these things, there's other things going on in our society that I think affect that generation. And one of them is that there's an increasing number of families in our society that are essentially not families, essentially people living on our own. It's not true in Ontario as a whole, but if you look at Canada, the most common family used to be what you might think of stereotypically as a family, right? A couple with children. And in the last census, for the first time ever, the most common family was one person living alone. Now, that's not quite true yet in Ontario. Toronto kind of throws that off a little bit, but it's coming. The trend is there. There are more people essentially trying to make it on their own without the traditional supports that we would see, particularly in terms of two incomes, right? The one thing that sort of a group living arrangement gives you is a lot of flexibility. One person losing their job, other person can stick up, and so on. Anyway, as I said, I left that out because it's a bit of a different story. But I like to say, Ontario is a bit like a Rubik's Cube, in that you can look at one thing like income, and if you switch that around, there's other things switching around at the same time, and one of them is family structure and how we're actually sort of trying to make it and establish and move forward out of sort of adolescence into adulthood in the labor market. Okay, I'm going to switch topics again and then talk a little bit about immigration patterns. So we know that Canada as a whole, including Ontario and especially Toronto, has a tremendous story to tell in terms of immigration. We know that we differentiate ourselves from other Western societies by being not shy about how important immigration is to our population growth, to the growth of our economy, how proud we are of that, and how determined we are to keep that moving forward. But I think when we looked, and part of this whole exercise for us was just trying to take a second look at the census. Once it comes out, you read all the headlines, and then you move on to other things. So we tried to kind of reread it and really kind of tease out, what's really important here. And the story that we took out of looking at the immigration numbers is this, we spend so much time celebrating the average. Ontario is a very diverse society. Toronto is a very diverse city. That we forget to look past that. And if you look past Toronto, the greater Toronto area, Ontario's story on immigration is not very good at the moment. And when you connect these back to those first population charts that I was showing, particularly the aging patterns, That's a real problem. So what I want to just do with the next slides is kind of point out just that difference between what Toronto is driving in terms of our average numbers around immigration and what's going on in the rest of the province. So you can see here, you've just got the proportion of your population who were born outside of Canada. So as Toronto, and this is the greater GTA now, it's getting to be almost 1 in 2 people were born outside the country. That's way more than New York, way more than London, and so on. It makes Toronto truly a unique global city, right? But you can see how quickly that, like it doesn't just edge gradually downward as you get to smaller communities, right? There's a cliff as soon as you leave Toronto and get to even Ottawa and Hamilton and so on, and then it keeps declining as you get to smaller and smaller communities in the province. You tell the story this way, so instead of the proportion of your population made up of immigrants, this is the distribution. So Toronto, the greater GTA, holds 44% of the province's population, but 70% of the province's immigrant population. If you put the first two together, Toronto and the other group, which is Ottawa, Hamilton, Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge, so the 4 biggest census cities in the province, they've got 83% of the province's immigrants are just in those 4 communities. 4 very large communities, right? But just 4 census areas in the province. So every other part outside of Toronto is underperforming, right? In the sense that their share of the province's immigrant population is lower than its share of the population as a whole. This just shows the proportion of your immigrants who are recent immigrants, and this is an important part of the picture, right? So it's kind of obvious, but it leads us to another point. So Toronto is doing better at attracting immigrants because it's attracting recent immigrants, right? That's where new people are coming. When we think of immigrants, we talk about immigration, right? We often think of new arrivals. But we have to keep in mind that a lot of immigrants have been with us for a long time. My parents are immigrants. They live in Ontario. They're in their 80s. They're wonderful people, but they're not driving our economy right now. Like, don't tell them I said that, right? But, they're not gainfully employed, right? So recent immigrants are really important. And you can see, again, Toronto and the big cities, a good share of their immigrants are recent immigrants. For a number of others, that's not the case. And that leads to this, which may look a little confusing at first, but I'll unpack it for you. But this is my second favorite slide in the presentation. So this is the distribution of a community's immigrant population by age. So just look at the blue curve first, right? So that's Toronto. So this has got an age curve that you would normally expect, right? So what are we saying? You look at the immigrant population in Toronto, you've got a small group of children, you've got a big group of people who are in the working population, and then you've got a good group of seniors at the end. And then the red line underneath that, which is kind of those mid-sized communities between 250 and 500,000 people, they've got fewer children, fewer working people, but still a good number. But actually, their largest proportion are over the age of 55 of their immigrant population. And then look at small-town Ontario. Their immigrant population, there are hardly any children. Fewer than a third are part of their working population. And over 60% are 55 age and over. So when you go back to the first slide in this section I showed you, first we said in smaller town Ontario, there are fewer immigrants. But now we're specifying many of those immigrants are already leaving the labor force, right? So it's even worse than we think. This is just more elaboration on that, but allows me to make another point. So this is, again, just the different characteristics. You can go through all this. Immigrants in smaller town Ontario are older. They're more likely to be from Britain or Europe, less likely to be from Asia. But they're also less likely to be on the sort of university side of education. And that's, again, partly because immigrants in smaller town Ontario are less likely to be recent immigrants. As you know, to become an immigrant, to arrive in Canada now, the point system puts a much heavier emphasis on education and skills, right? So recent immigrants are much more highly educated, right? So again, just telling the story, there are fewer immigrants outside of Toronto. Those immigrants are older, and they're less likely to be highly educated. Doesn't mean a university education is everything, but if you're building an economy, right, you need some of it. One way to summarize this, in Toronto, if you take 100 people in Toronto, of the whole population, so of that 100 people, some are children, some are retired, some are working, and of some of those working, some of them have a university degree, and of some of those working people with a university degree, some of them are immigrants. So 10 out of 100 people in Toronto are university-educated immigrants. In small-town Ontario, it's 1 out of 100. So that's the difference. Okay, so I'm going to keep throwing out the numbers, and then I'll try and sort of summarize, why is this important? Where does it leave us? But as I said, I thought I'd show some of the public opinion data, just because we happen to have published it last week, and so we've been talking about it a little bit. We did a survey in 2017 on a whole bunch of different issues that has nothing to do with these things that we've been talking about. But because we had a good sample in Ontario, we had 2,000 people in Ontario, which for a public opinion survey is pretty good. When you do have a national survey, Ontario usually has about 400 people in a national survey. So having 2,000 in Ontario was pretty good and allows us to look at the results across the province. And we asked the question, is there a kind of urban-rural cleavage in the province between how people, see public policy priorities and so on? And we actually expected that there would be. We thought that on most issues, the cities would all kind of cluster on one end, and the small towns and rural areas would cluster on the other. And in fact, you kind of think, why did we think that? Well, we weren't alone in thinking that. We had a question on the survey which actually asked people, do people who live in urban areas and rural areas share the same values? And most Ontarians would say no. So most Ontarians would expect that there was a pretty big value difference between urban and rural people in the province. And on the whole, that's actually not the case. There are way more similarities than differences. But despite that, and that's, if I was just doing the presentation on that, I would have shown you 10 slides to just back up what I just said. And now I'm going to show you the exception, because I'm trying not to take your whole afternoon. So one of the exceptions, when there is a fairly noticeable difference depending on basically the size of community or how urban you are, is specifically when you ask about the local economy. So if you ask a very general question about the economy, how's Canada doing? Most Ontarians will give a fairly similar response. But if you ask specifically, how economically has your local community been doing over the last 5 years? You can see there's a good bit of difference. So only 14% of people in Northern Ontario would say that things have been getting better in their local community. And that compares to as many as 45% in, these are funny names here, but the 401 corridor is basically drive from Milton to Windsor, right? All the way down London, Kitchener, all the way down that way. So the more, Toronto, Kitchener, Waterloo, Ottawa, and so on, just have a more optimistic feel to how things are going in their local community than people in the north, people in the east, people in the southwest. There's an interesting sort of echo of that, and I won't spend too much time on this, but again, when we ask people in Ontario about international trade in general, everyone's in favor. It's a good thing. We want more trade agreements. NAFTA is good for Canada, right? If you ask specifically, have these trade agreements benefited or harmed your community? You can still see those green bars of benefits are bigger in general than the sort of off-red bars. But nonetheless, the more rural you are, the more likely you say that those agreements have actually harmed your specific community, even though you're in favor of them in principle. And it's actually twice as much as in Toronto, right, where you only have about 16%. So there is, as I said, I'm not showing you the counter evidence here. On the whole, you ask people about healthcare, taxes, climate change. There's not really a huge difference. But you ask about how things are going in your community, there is a bit of a noticeable difference. I'll make two other points, and then I'll try and sum up and leave you to the speakers for the rest of the afternoon. On immigration and on some of these questions, I should correct myself, because I said there's not a big urban-rural difference on a lot of these questions, and that's true. But interestingly enough, Toronto actually stands out. And it's worth specifying, because on a lot of these questions, if you look at sort of the north and Hamilton, they'll be exactly the same. The rural east and Kitchener-Waterloo will be the same. So Toronto is as different from the 905 and Hamilton on some of these public opinion questions as it is from Northern or Eastern Ontario, which is kind of interesting. So anyway, this is a question about immigration levels. And this is fairly typical. This is not new. There's not been any kind of bump. There's no sort of profound change in how we view immigration. Roughly speaking, about 40% are comfortable with the levels of immigration we have now. 40% would want fewer immigrants. About 20% would want more immigrants. And again, that's not out of whack or unusual. And you can add these different bars up in lots of different ways. But the way I like to say it is in every part of the province, at least 50% of the population says that either we've got about right or we could do even more. So there's not a majority certainly looking for fewer immigrants in the province. And again, that's kind of, I'm showing this partly to link up with those population slides that I showed. And then the last one is just one of my kind of favorite questions to think about, although it's a little troubling, particularly for those of us who work either with or in or near government. So we have a question about whether governments have a positive impact on most people's lives, have a negative impact on most people's lives, or no impact at all. And you can see a lot of the regions of the province, there's a majority that says governments have a negative impact on most people's lives. This is not a question about political parties or any particular government. This doesn't even specify whether we're talking about the federal government, provincial government, local governments. We asked this question before the election, after the election, doesn't change. So this is not a sort of particular, how do you want to vote question. This is how do you feel about the institution of government in your life, right? So this makes governing, right, a huge challenge. If as soon as you engage with the public, you have to confront the fact that their starting assumption is that you're doing harm. Right? Now, the other reason I showed this is there's only one region of the country where the proportion of people who say government has a positive impact is bigger than the proportion who say they have a negative impact, and that's Toronto. So it just points out that point that I tried to make, that Toronto is a kind of outlier on some of these issues. Now, that doesn't automatically connect back to some of the population issues that I was covering, but just in the last minute, kind of try and sum up some takeaways from that population. So, the main message, and this is the one that I would assume that you all walked in the room with already, but let me kind of just emphasize it. The main message, of course, is that in a province as big and diverse as Ontario, averages can throw you off, right? The average growth rate, the average immigration rate, the average income rate just masks what's really going on, which is different in different corners of the province. That, of course, makes governing the province a challenge. You have to deal with growing population in some communities and declining populations in the others. As I said, you have to sort of combine the need to build schools in some areas with the need to close schools in other areas. But among the sort of recommendations we came up with, and that's the great thing about being a think tank, we can just describe all this and then leave the room and hope that other people come up with practical solutions. So that's what we normally do. But we tried to offer a few ideas, and I think one of the key ones for me is that we need to do a better job of connecting immigration strategies with regional economic development strategies. And to make the point, and without I'm not trying to criticize anyone, that's not my job, but a few years ago the province did develop an immigration strategy, and unless I misread it, it didn't say anything about geography. It didn't say anything about place, about where we would like immigrants to settle. Right, just sort of treated the whole province neutrally. And you can see why politically that's important, right? No one wants to play favorites. But when you look at the pressures that are on some of the communities in the province, those age curves, right? The pressure with the fact that there's only 70 new workers coming for every 100 workers who are retiring. I think we have to start maybe being a little less shy about saying that we need to embrace the particular needs that particular communities in particular corners of the province have that are going to be different, And if we're going to develop an immigration strategy, we can really talk to employers in those communities and build the sort of pathways to bring them, the workers and the new residents and the taxpayers and the caregivers that those communities are going to need. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for having me and for allowing me to share some of this with you. It's all on our website, which is pretty easy to find, given that it's mowatcenter.ca. We're a think tank just located up the street. We were created about 10 years ago by the provincial government to kind of help them think through some of the future challenges they're facing. And I wish you a very productive end of the afternoon and entire conference. And thanks very much.
Don't you go away. Good afternoon. My name is Brian Lewis, councillor in the town of Halton Hills and also an OGRA board member. It's my role, my function to say thank you to Andrew, but I do it with mixed emotions. When he started talking about red line and blue lines and that kind of stuff, being a former NHL official, I got all excited and thought sooner or later we're going to hear about the winning goal. But the part that really bothered me when he was talking about aging society, why did they ask me to say thank you, Andrew, for very entertaining and insightful and informative statistics? So the standing ovation was not available, Andrew, but we thank you anyway. In 2018, the OGRA Board of Directors made a decision to prioritize road safety. In order to know what to do, we first decided it was important to ask Ontarians what they thought about this issue. In November of 2018, OGRA hired that world-famous firm, Nanos Research, to conduct this research itself. Here to share the results of the OGRA's manager is the manager of policy and research himself, Mr. Scott Butler. Scott?
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. As Brian alluded to at the outset, I'm here to talk about road safety, but not road safety in terms of a strategy, not road safety in terms of what you should be doing, but road safety in terms of what your constituents actually think about the idea. And I want to run through a bit of a story about how we got here before I actually do that. So, let's see if I can figure this out. Hey, there we go. How we got here. We have a 3-year advocacy cycle at OGRA. So every 3 years we go through, we take a bit of a temperature for the organization and we say what's important to us and why is it important. And under that there's a whole series, just like a political platform, you have a whole series of planks that we are identifying. And the objective number 1 was to understand the new government. So the new government is not just the folks at Queen's Park, it's also the folks in, it's also people in Ottawa. We heard from Parliamentary Secretary Mendicino earlier today. And it was a recognition that we were going to have a whole new crop of councillors as well. And when we actually looked at it, we realized that there was this real emphasis on road safety. People were suddenly very interested in it. And the motivations behind that, I don't think are terribly, I think the motivations are good, but what was driving this agenda and the importance of this issue seemed to be a lot of tragedies that were playing out in the media. Then we looked at sector-wide advocacy goals and priorities. So when we talked about road safety, we realized all of a sudden there were a lot of people in a lot of different sectors of the economy engaged in this. And we thought there might be an opportunity to bring some of these sort of disparate organizations together to figure out ways to collaborate in terms of driving forward an agenda that would address this idea. And the final thing was building a whole sector plan. So this is where we sort of kick off objective number 3, this talk as well as the panel that's about to follow. How we got here. 2017, a few of you may have remembered this guy, Michael Koval Anderson, Danish guy, came in, told you bikes were the answer to everything and everything you were doing was wrong when it came to bikes. That resonated. We heard from a lot of you. A lot of you liked what he said. Considerably many more of you didn't like what he said. But nonetheless, it showed that it was a good idea. A lot of what he told us, though, stuck with us. And we looked at ways we could begin addressing this. And we realized there's still a lot of work to do in this realm. And so that was, I think, where we really saw a tip within the organization in terms of what we were looking to do and why we were doing it. Last year, you would have remembered the woman on the, I guess, your left, Jeanette Sadiq Khan, who was the head of transportation services for New York City. She came out here, her microphone failed, and she proceeded to yell for 5 minutes while we scrambled to adjust. But her presentation was looking at what she called street fights, how you could modify your roads to make your communities more inclusive, how you could make them safer. And she was doing this in New York City. Now, I mean, she, as I have chosen here, had the advantage of having a very powerful mayor behind her who said, go and do it. And she also had the advantage of having a $20 billion budget, which I think some of you may like to have if you're making decisions. Nonetheless, she was doing it in New York. Everybody thinks they know the place, so there was a lot of expectations there. Then there's this august group. You may have seen them. That's the board of directors, actually 2018-2019 board. And they said, we've heard from these people, let's do something about this. So in November, we went off and met with 50, 60 MPPs, and we stressed this. We need to do something. We eventually came up with this ask. After a lot of research, we landed on this idea of Vision Zero. There are a lot of frameworks out there, but when we looked at it and we looked at the applicability of this framework and where it could go, we realized Vision Zero was the one that had resonance in Toronto, it had resonance in Leamington, it had resonance in Cornwall and Kenora, and every point in between. So that was where we landed, and we thought we were asking the Minister of Transportation to put together a working group to begin looking at how we can do this. How can we work with the province? How can we work with municipalities, with automakers, with safety organizations, with public health, you name it. Everybody seems to have a lot of interest in this. And so it's the beginning of a conversation we continue to have. We knew when we got there, we were going to get hammered. Why is this important? How do we know what people think? So we hired Nanos Research, as Brian said at the outset, and we asked them some questions. And we weren't talking about Vision Zero specifically, we were talking about road safety. And not surprisingly, about 90% of folks identified this as an important issue, as a fundamentally important issue. When we asked them how that had changed over time, we realized that people see it. It's marginal differences, but it's still a big concern. And there's a sense that for half the population, streets are not safe. How we're managing them, how we're designing them, how we're maintaining them isn't actually working for them, or at least they perceive that it's not working for them. Again, this is just another iteration breaking down the regional demographic differences, but you see how consistent those numbers are. The one telling point, the younger, we were talking about millennials earlier, they apparently feel very unsafe, and that may be in part, we're seeing that generation isn't driving nearly as much. And then we're also seeing a demographic, 30 to 39, primarily parents, also feel the same way. Unsolicited, open-ended question. What would you do to make roads safer? The number one response we received, and this surprised us quite frankly, was add bike lanes. In fact, we asked Nick if this was right, and he assured us, yes, that it conformed to all the expectations he has of any survey. But we were surprised to actually see bike lanes adopted as the number one response. And I mean, it's right on par when you look at this with enforcement and with better road maintenance. And there's a whole series of other, I think, valid objectives that have been identified within there. We asked them who's responsible. And as a municipal association, we were delighted when when Ontarians thought the provincial government was most responsible. We also saw that people have a fairly good understanding, I think, of where responsibility ultimately lies. We see the provincial government identified, we see the municipal governments identified, and we see road users identified. They make up the lion's share of the overall survey. It gives us an opportunity and an insight into the fact that people do, I think, fundamentally understand how our roads are governed in this province. And so what we've done is we've begun engaging those organizations that represent each of those sectors to figure out how we can collaborate to drive something forward. We asked them if they would increase investment in tax dollars. So we didn't ask them if they wanted to pay more taxes for road safety. We asked them if they'd be willing to put more of the taxes they already pay into road safety. And 70%, I mean, it's an important distinction, but 70% supported or somewhat supported this. The opposition was actually quite small. Again, this is validating the previous slide, and it's demonstrating that people have prioritized it and they also understand who's responsible for it. And again, when we look at that table on on the side there, it doesn't matter what the demographic analysis is based on age or even position, like geography within Ontario, the numbers are fairly consistent. This was a cheeky question. We designed this just to test and see what people, how they actually felt. So it was an open-ended question. It wasn't open-ended, sorry. It was a choice, so you had to choose 1 to 5 or whatever the case was. But we asked them if you would allow a child to bike to school. And it was split. It was like that initial one. Approximately half of people don't feel or don't know if they would allow a child to bike to school, a child they care for. The other half felt comfortable or somewhat comfortable. You do see a couple of things that jump out right away in this. Women feel notably less safe with the idea of allowing children to bike to school. And we also see, again, the spikes happen when people are either likely to be biking themselves or have children biking. It was a way to test to make sure that in effect, what we were trying to do is we were trying to measure their emotional attachment to the idea of road safety. And we asked them why they felt the way they felt. And the number one response that came back, and this again cuts across all those demographic categories, is that people felt the roads were not safe, that the infrastructure was inadequate, or there was too much traffic. There's a long list of other things there, but this was somewhat surprising. Now the problem we had, we wanted to make sure we understood how people were actually using the roads. It's enough to provide us feedback, but we wanted to make sure there was a way to actually understand who it was that was responding. So the final thing we did was we asked them to tell us how you use your road network, your local road network primarily. And almost all people were drivers. So when we got to this point and we began looking at the analysis here, what we were able to draw back is that, rather surprisingly, most people are drivers, and most people feel things like bike lanes are the best way to actually improve safety for all road users. This is not what we anticipated, quite frankly. It was somewhat surprising that this happened. But it gave us the insights that we needed to go forward and be more informed when we engaged those people at Queen's Park, when we engaged our members of provincial parliament. It also allowed us to have a really robust conversation at the board about how we could position this argument in a way that allowed you as road authorities or as councils to move forward with some assurance that investments that you make in this space won't meet opposition. In fact, they should be welcomed if this research is valid, and we have no reason to think that it isn't. So, final one here. We're looking at the relative comforts. I think I went backwards. I did. That was the final one. So thank you. I think we're about to bring out a panel, but yeah, we'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. Knowing what Ontarians think about the issue, the OGRA board then looked at different road safety approaches. After a lot of discussion, without fisticuffs, which they had to put that into my script, the board decided that Vision Zero was the best approach. And again, I became suspicious when they start talking to an official about vision. Just so you people know, we have an eye test every year at training camp, and most years I passed. We have assembled a panel of knowledgeable individuals and practitioners to discuss what Vision Zero is and why we should be pursuing it. Joining us on stage are Mark Wilson, Project Manager with Going the Extra Mile for Safety; Jessica Yaremchuk, Director of Risk Management Services at Frank Cowan Company; Adam Bell, National Vision Zero Lead with WSP Canada; and Dr. Charles Gardner, Chief Medical Officer of Health for the Simcoe-Muskoka District Health Unit. Thomas Barakat, OGRA Senior Policy Advisor, will be the moderator for this session. Enjoy the time.
All right. Let's have a seat. All right, well, good afternoon and welcome. As Brian said, my name is Thomas Barakat, and I'm pleased to be the moderator for the session this afternoon. Avoidable roadway fatalities and injuries continue to happen with far too much regularity across Ontario. Rather than accepting these tragedies as inevitable events, Ontario needs to adapt a Vision Zero framework to eliminate them. The experiences of other jurisdictions, both domestically and internationally, demonstrate that when planners and advocates implement Vision Zero, our roadways become safer and more inclusive. Most importantly, the number of tragedies decline. Today, we're going to examine the imperative of moving forward with a Made for Ontario Vision Zero strategy. Our panelists come from a variety of sectors, so we are going to begin by having them speak about why Vision Zero is important from their perspectives. Adam, you're the first person I've actually met who has Vision Zero in their job title. Perhaps you could start us off.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to start off by talking about something that happened in 2001. A young boy was getting a routine MRI. He was 6 years old, and unfortunately, he was killed during this MRI. And so I'm going to talk about the key facts of what happened. First of all, he was under a general anesthetic because of his age. So when you undergo an MRI, you need to remain very still. And so there was a need for him to be under a general anesthetic. The oxygen source that was piped in to the room, the MRI exam room, was malfunctioning. The MRI nurses ran out of the room to actually try and deal with the malfunction. The anesthesiologist called for oxygen, and a non-MRI nurse happened to be in the exam room, and she heard this request for the oxygen, and so she handed the doctor an oxygen tank. Now, an MRI is a highly magnetic device, and it pulled the oxygen tank tragically into the MRI and killed the patient. The root cause summary of this, sorry, I think I might have. So the root cause of this, I'm sorry, it's a root cause summary, I'm trying to go back. Right. Okay, so the root causes of this accident were there was a requirement for sedation and thereby a requirement for oxygen for the patient to ensure that their oxygen levels were high enough. The piped-in oxygen source failed. There were untrained staff in the MRI exam room, and there were metal oxygen containers in the room. There were possible solutions to this problem. Not having metal tanks in the room would be an example. Control of non-MRI staff in the room, another solution. There could have been a backup oxygen supply that was piped in separately so that there was a second source. Or even, there could have even been non-magnetic oxygen tanks. So why am I talking about this for Vision Zero presentation, I'm sure you're wondering. It's really just to illustrate the need for root cause analysis in Vision Zero. There are 4 components to Vision Zero. There's a focus on KSI collisions, or killed in severe injury collisions. There's a need for to account for human error and vulnerability. There's a shared responsibility among different groups, and it needs to be at a planning level. The approach needs to be a planning level approach. So Vision Zero action plans in Ontario, what we've seen so far is there isn't this root cause analysis occurring with fatal and severe injury collisions. The Vision Zero programs that have been taken on tend to be heavy on programs and things. There tends to be some extrapolation of data. It tends to be light on evidence-based solutions. They tend to be also based on other Vision Zero action plans. So what's happening in New York, what's happening in Austin, what's happening in Edmonton. They have plans that they've already put in place, and there's a lot of sort of, okay, well, what would we like to take from this plan and that plan? They also tend to be very engineering-based. So how can we improve Vision Zero in Ontario? We can begin to undertake root cause analysis. We can begin to look at fatal and severe injury collisions very carefully using more data sources. So currently, when Vision Zero action plans are undertaken, they typically are only considering motor vehicle accident reports or police reports for those collisions. They don't, for instance, include coroner information. They don't include hospital reports. They don't look into even media sources or surveillance video, anything that's available to give you that picture of what actually happened so that you can do that root cause analysis. So that will be required to actually develop holistic solutions. It needs to involve all system designers as well. And when I say system designers, it was traditionally, when we looked at road safety and engineering, they were typically the traffic engineers that were taking on the road safety. The way that Vision Zero is envisioned is it needs to be a systemic change, and it needs to include all different groups considered to be system designers. So of course you have traffic engineers, you have community planners though, you have vehicle designers and also manufacturers, other decision makers, law enforcement, emergency response. All of these groups need to be incorporated in so that we can come up with good solutions based on evidence. So as stakeholders and decision makers, we need your support in analyzing complete fatal and severe injury collision data and developing unique evidence-based countermeasures. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Adam. Jessica, you want to? Or have it? Yeah?
Me next?
Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. I've got a few note pages with some numbers on them that I'm going to bring up here. So my name's Jessica, and I work for the Frank Cowan Company. Some of you may have heard me speak at municipal conferences before and know that talking about judgment trends is probably one of my favorite topics. So I'm here today to bring or look through that lens of what are these tragedies costing us? What are these injuries that we see on the roadways? What is it costing our municipalities and your municipal insurers? So over the years, we've seen a drastic increase in judgment awards. So if I look back to 1999, I have a 14-year-old who suffered a brain injury, got awarded $7 million. 2007, same sort of brain injury on a 22-year-old, $11.5 million was the judgment. 2007 again, $17 million for a child that got brain injury. 2008, I've got a case, $18.5 million for a 15-year-old. And then up in 2012, we've had judgments hit the $20 million mark. So in that short span, you can see how these judgment awards, they're not increasing with some sort of inflationary index. 2007 to now, going from 7 million to almost 20 million. So why is that happening? The main impetus for increasing judgments are future care costs. Now, that's a double-edged sword to talk about that. About 30 years ago, if someone were catastrophically injured in an accident, what would happen to them? They'd go to a facility, right? It's sad, but they'd probably be put in a facility somewhere, and that's where they would live out their days. What do we do now? We set them up at home, right? So we set them up at home. We make sure that they have 24-hour-a-day nursing care. We make sure that their home is retrofitted for a wheelchair if needed. We make sure that they have all the medications they need, access to all the medical equipment that they need, access to go to the hospital, come back from the hospital for tests and exams that they can't do in the home. Imagine how much more that costs. Now, you also have lawyers saying, okay, well, the average Canadian moves twice in their life or 3 times in their life. My client here in a wheelchair, why shouldn't she be allowed to move 2 or 3 times as well? So now future care costs are also including retrofitting 2 houses instead of 1. Now, if that's my sister or my mother or my best friend who's in an accident, I want them set up like that. I want them to be comfortable in their home. I want them to live out their days in dignity in their home and have the best access to medical care. But for a municipality and for a municipal insurer, that's costing us a lot of money. We've seen about 2 times the number of brain injury cases in the past decade. Why is that? It's because we have medical science that can detect brain injuries. It's not that there's actually more brain injuries happening now, but it's that we can assess them better and we know when there's a brain injury. So instead of having an RPN come into your home at $25 an hour, you have a brain injury specialist nurse coming in at $50 an hour. So it's very expensive that we have such an amazing medical system that these people that are catastrophically injured, not only do we have them completely set up at home, but imagine how much longer they're living. I'm sure all of us in this room know of someone that's been injured or has fought disease that is living much, much longer than someone would have 30 years ago. So these medical advances are amazing, but we have to pay for that person and everything they need for the rest of that time. Just to give you an example, when I say that future care costs are the biggest part of the judgment, in 2008, there was a motor vehicle accident, McNeil and Bryant. The court awarded about $18.5 million to a 15-year-old female who got severe brain injury as a result of this accident. Of that $18.5 million, over $15 million of it was for the future care. We settled a couple years ago, midway through a trial. It was another car accident, and the settlement was $8.3 million. Over $5 million of that, again, was for future care. We have a case where it was a motor vehicle accident, and the court award was about $17 million. Over $11 million of that was future care costs. So if, with something like Vision Zero, we can keep our roads safer and we can decrease the number of catastrophic injuries and accidents that happen, I think we're all going to be happy because we're saving people. But as the insurer for municipalities, I think we'll all be happy that we're also saving money.
Thank you. Some of you have seen me already this morning, and I won't keep you long. I have a short video I want you to have a look at, and I'll say a few words after it. Hey, welcome to Sweden. My name's Mark, and I'm a member of GEMS, a road safety committee in northeastern Ontario. Our name stands for Going the Extra Mile for Safety. Our goal is to have a safer and more efficient Highway 11 Trans-Canada Highway in northern Ontario. So why am I here in Sweden? Well, I'm looking at 2+1 roads, like the one you see behind me. You'll notice a barrier in the middle of this road, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. Over 20 years ago, Sweden established a road safety program called Vision Zero. The goal of Vision Zero was to eliminate serious injuries and fatalities on the Swedish road system. Well, Sweden has done very well. They're not at zero yet, but they are considered to be one of the safest countries in the world in which to drive. A key component of Vision Zero was the establishment of 2+1 roads. They prevent head-on collisions and prevent inappropriate passing. So we would like to tell you the story of 2+1 roads in Sweden and in other countries where this road model has been adopted. So I welcome you to come along on this journey to see how 2+1 roads can have a positive effect on road safety in Canada. So just a quick translation, hey hey means hello in Swedish. So the story of 2+1 roads starts with Vision Zero in rural areas of Sweden. Wide two-lane roads, as you see on the left, had serious safety issues. 2+1 roads were developed with Vision Zero principles in mind. They took the kinetic energy out of crashes by eliminating head-on collisions. The barriers also prevented inappropriate passing. The barrier types, they started originally with the cable barrier style and have now moved to more commonly to the solid steel barrier style. 2+1 roads work in any environment, whether it's rocks and trees or open spaces. And there are a tremendous amount of benefits, or tremendous number of benefits associated with 2+1 roads. They're built on existing platforms at cost 75% lower than divided highways. They don't bypass towns and villages. They do not significantly affect private entrances. And they are a financially responsible way to build roads that have the same safety performance as divided highways. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Charles Gardner. I'm Medical Officer of Health for a local public health unit. I live in Barrie, so I'm with the Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit. The whole purpose of public health is to prevent disease, and that includes the prevention of injuries. So I'm very happy to be speaking today and share a few thoughts. This doesn't want to advance. Here we go. So, there are, of course, statistics that you can consider. 50,000 injuries in the province per year, 500 deaths per year in the province from road-related incidents. 20% of those are vulnerable users, pedestrians or cyclists. However, I think it really brings home the reality of all of those injuries and deaths when you look at the paper and you read locally of individuals who've lost their lives or have been injured or are affected legally because of crashes or because of drinking and driving. To me, it takes it home anyway. And of course, because that's so common, it touches on all of our lives. I'm sure that many of you would know of individuals, or you yourselves might be an individual who is injured on the road, or know of people who are killed. But we've actually had, if you look over time, a success story with injuries on the road. They used to actually be far worse, remarkably enough. And if you look at the pattern over time, you see, for one, that there's been a decline in per capita crashes, but on top of that, those crashes have been less deadly. And you should probably ask, why is that? And you can correlate those changes over time with policy that came along. The requirement for seat belts, putting in place a lot more restriction about drinking and driving, penalties related to that, awareness raising related to that. Graduated license programs for new drivers, and there are certainly drivers who are at higher risk, considerably higher risk, and new drivers would be in that category. Distracted driving legislation, limiters on speed in large trucks, legislation against aggressive driving such as street racing. All of those things have contributed over time so that we have a much lower rate than we once had. Some issues improve and some issues arise and become a problem that weren't in the past. And so drinking and driving has improved over time, and while it's improved, we've had distracted driving coming along, seemingly taking its place, certainly having the same degree of impact on risk that drinking and driving has. So we need to be nimble, I would say, in looking at the data and responding to risk over time. And we need to be aware that although we've made improvements in particular with regards to the safety of those in cars, those around cars remain at risk. So pedestrians and cyclists remain at a high degree of risk, are kind of left behind when it comes to addressing risk. Ours is very much a car culture in Ontario. The 401 is the busiest highway in North America, and this particular stretch sees about 500,000 cars a day go over it. So that's very intensive amount of driving. And although you can certainly take an approach of improving the safety of the act of driving itself remains a hazardous activity. And so you should also look at reducing our exposure to driving, the distances we have to go, the number of trips we need to do if we want to have a further successful impact on those rates of death and injury. And so some places in the world are far less car intensive and far more pedestrian or transit intensive than others. If you look at Tokyo, for example, it's actually less than 20% of trips that are done by motor vehicles. The rest is transit, walking, cycling, as opposed to Vancouver, which is closer to 80%. And Vancouver is the best city of its size in Canada for the other modes of transportation, the active transportation. And so their streets look very different. People-intensive walking streets look very different and feel very different from car-intensive streets. If we want to encourage people to walk or cycle because it's healthier, it's also important to know that when you mode shift and you move people into transit or into walking or cycling, you reduce the amount of driving that happens, and that reduces the amount of exposure that people have to cars. It's actually safer for drivers if you move more people out of driving. But to do that, you've got to make it safe for people to walk and cycle. It has to be inviting. It has to be doable. If you look at Europe, say the Netherlands, almost half of their trips are made by means other than driving as opposed to Canada or the United States. And that inversely correlates very well with how safe it is to do those things. In the Netherlands, it is 60 times safer per kilometer to cycle than it is in the United States. That's enormous. That goes a long way to explaining the difference. So in 2014, I was among a number of medical officers of health that looked at the health benefits of Metrolinx and how much chronic disease could we shift by getting people to be a bit more active and have less exposure to poor air quality by having them move a very marginal amount into transit and walking. We found that with such a change, we could prevent over 300 deaths a year and 1,000 new cases of diabetes in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area with those modest shifts. Diabetes is a very expensive disease to treat and also very unfortunate for people who have it because it leads to very unpleasant complications. And on top of that, we noted that there would be fewer injuries, although we didn't quantify that particular effect. My point here is if you can have the benefit of reducing injuries by making walking and cycling more palatable for people, and if you can address other issues related to risk on the road, you can have an even greater benefit from chronic disease prevention. Spin-off benefits are actually even greater than the injury benefits. There can be improvements with rural areas as well. Small rural communities can be made more compact, more safe to walk and cycle. They can have a more intensive transit, and then they can do a variety of other things related to assessing the risks of individual intersections and highways and such to make those safer as well. Certainly the idea of dividing highways as much as possible, I think, makes tremendous sense. So, winter need not stop us. It doesn't stop those in Scandinavia, places like Oulu, Finland, where they maintain 10% of their mode share through the winter for cycling, even though they're just south of the Arctic Circle. Nor does it stop this individual in Yellowknife last February at minus 30 degrees. Their streets are less intensive with traffic. They have lower speed limits, which invites more active transportation, and people find ways of dealing with the cold. So Vision Zero is about shifting our view. In the past, with Elmer the safety elephant, we were told to look twice before crossing the street. The onus was put on us as the individuals to brave the streets. Now we need to consider how we design streets and communities around them and transit systems to make it safe for everybody. We've had declining injuries on motorists. We need to do the same for pedestrians and cyclists, and we need to continue making things safer for motorists. And in doing so, we can also have an even greater impact on disease related to physical inactivity or air quality. I see Vision Zero as a way of prompting all of that. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for your presentations. Now we'll move over into a little bit of a moderated discussion here. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and our panelists feel free to answer anything that anything you want to add. So the first question that I had prepared for you guys was, so how does having Vision Zero as a goal or concept translate into actually having safer streets?
I can take
yes, why don't you start us off, Adam? Yeah, okay.
Just setting a goal and saying that is zero doesn't necessarily mean that that is what the actual goal is. It's a vision. It's something to look for or look towards. So when they were deciding on the name of this, there was this concept of, well, what should we call it? Should we call it Vision 10? Should we call it Vision 100? Whatever it is. And there's really no answer other than zero. And yes, I think that it has a lot of power. It's actually the brand itself has really proliferated around the world as an initiative.
I think just a comment on the goal is important for sure, and the Vision Zero principles, which are trying to take kinetic energy out of collisions and trying to make better drivers and better road users by looking at the system. And I think it's that human factor that's actually really important when we look at Vision Zero is we're all human and we make mistakes. And so the better we can design the system, the better we will survive in that system. And I think that's a key point of how it will make better and safer streets and roads.
I would say that taking a system approach is essential if you're going to make a change. We've had the better part of a century putting the onus on the individual, and we've only made progress when we've made policy change, when we've had system change, when we've made requirements for say, seatbelt legislation. And so we have to have a system approach if we're going to make a further improvement. We have to make it a priority as well. And we have to use data. And certainly this is an approach that uses data to assess risk locations and a commitment to change infrastructure there. I would suggest that you need to ramp it up even higher and say, what is the data saying overall? What's it saying about modes of transportation that are safest overall to make bigger decisions at a municipal level and provincially?
That's a good point. So we heard Scott earlier here talk about there was widespread support for safer roads, and realistically, I mean, who doesn't want safer roads? We all want safer roads. So I guess a question for you guys is, well, what objections are being made to Vision Zero?
might start that.
Sure.
When I was traveling in Sweden researching the 2+1 for our project in Northern Ontario, I also took the opportunity to attend a Vision Zero conference in Lithuania before my visit to Sweden. And there was actually a session there on exactly your question. So, what are people saying on the opposite side to Vision Zero? And there were some interesting comments like, that it's not ethical, or it's utopian, it's counterproductive. These are some of the comments. But as you look at the sort of the acceptance of Sweden's Vision Zero principles, you see it being used in so many other organizations and documents, and all the scientific literature supports this principle because it is an important goal to set. We see it in the World Health Organization documents. We see it in United Nations documents. So clearly it has merit, although there are a few people who don't see it that way. So yeah.
I would just point to the fact that it is all about evidence-based decision making. And so anyone who counters Vision Zero or has complaints about it being utopian, I mean, I've got we have the numbers that say how much these accidents are costing. This is not some utopian vision. This is an idea that everyone can get behind. Look at the cross-section of people on this stage right now and in this room. It's a goal, it's a vision that everyone can get behind, support, and hopefully have less accidents.
There's oftentimes, if ever I hear feedback, it's you can't legislate against stupidity. I always hear that. And if you look at virtually every other field other than road transportation, they do legislate against it. There is legislation that, and we use the word stupidity, but it's error. And many other industries, if you think about the construction industry, you think about the airline industry, you think about any other transportation industry, actually, they always consider that. It's always a part of their system, whereas it's not for some reason in ours.
That's a good comparison with the airline industry, and I realize it's different mode of transport, but the 2,000 people we kill every year on the roads in Canada is the same as one A330 airliner crashing every month in Canada. I have a feeling that would make the news, and nobody would fly. So you make an excellent point there, that we do legislate for that, and we legislate systems to ensure that doesn't happen. Yeah.
I don't know if I've heard open opposition. I think perhaps inertia is just as much of a problem. If you don't deliberately choose to do this, then you're choosing not to do it, right? So it takes a commitment collectively, locally, people getting organized and willing to look at something that's very unfortunate, a local tragic death, and ask what could be changed here, almost a willingness to admit that it was less than perfect, the way it was constructed the first time. And I guess as human beings, we don't like to do that. We don't do that readily.
Yeah, that's a good point. So Vision Zero has a really big infrastructure component to it. And as we all know in this room, infrastructure does not come cheap. So what are the costs and risks of not moving forward with Vision Zero? Yeah, you want to start us off?
I can start. Actually, what I've found is, and sort of going back to that MRI example that I used in the presentation, when we identify what the root cause problems are, occasionally, or in many cases, those solutions, like for instance, in the case of the MRI, yeah, you could have a piped-in second oxygen source, but it could be as simple as not allowing non-MRI trained people in the room at the time. So there are many ways to address a single problem when you get to the root cause of the issue. So there are examples where there are many low-cost solutions to really major problems.
Jessica certainly spoke to the tremendous cost of settlement. So there's a counter cost, of course, many counter costs to not preventing an injury or a death where you can, or failing to do so in the future when you identify a problem. If you go to the big picture, it's been estimated that injuries and deaths on the roads in Ontario cost us $1.2 billion a year. Half of those are healthcare costs. When we as MOH, as medical officers of health, looked at the cost effectiveness of the $2 billion a year being put into Metrolinx, we found that it was more than offset by the healthcare costs that were avoided with the prevention of those deaths and those diabetes cases, and that didn't even take into account injuries. So when looking at the costs, you've got to look and preferably enumerate both sides of the equation, right? I think if you enumerate both sides, you can come up with the argument that it's worth the investment.
Yeah. Often using figures. Sorry.
Yeah. No, I was going to say I completely agree. There's numbers on the other side to support why it's silly that you wouldn't at least try.
Just one quick comment, a little more local cost. So the project we're working on in Northern Ontario, by not doing something, it literally affects our mobility. And so that is a cost. It's a harder cost to put a dollar amount on, but it affects our mobility. And I think that's key. Mobility is, it's very important to all of us in our society today. And so roads that are closed and because of fatal accidents and that type of thing affect our mobility.
Oh, you got, okay. Okay, so what are some initial steps that municipalities can undertake for a few easy wins when getting started with Vision Zero? What's some low-hanging fruit? You want to start us off, Jessica?
Sure. So I'm in risk management, as you know, and part of my job is to help municipalities lower their risk, whether that's in their playgrounds or on their roads or in their community centers. And I think there's a lot of possible low-cost solutions. I think that the first step for a municipality that they could take would be to work with your insurance company and get a claims run. Where are your motor vehicle accidents happening in your municipality? That is something that can be done like that. Then you find out that 50% of your motor vehicle accidents are happening at these 3 intersections. So you have a roads engineer who, hopefully your insurer can provide you. We use Brian Anderson. Can go out, take a look at that intersection and look at whether it complies with OTM standards, look at are there sightline deficiencies. Cutting branches back is a pretty cheap way to stop an accident from happening, but that's what we see a lot of the time. The accidents are from things like not having an oversized stop sign where you should. Putting in rumble strips is another low-cost way. So I think that going out and assessing, first getting that claims run and looking where your accidents are, and then assessing those areas because there could be those low-hanging fruit, quick and easy, low-cost solutions to problems. And you know what? Maybe you'll find that there's an area where you've got a windy road and a hill, and there's absolutely nothing you can do in your budget right now to make that road any safer. Lower the speed limit. Simple solution. Can't lower the water, raise the bridge.
I would throw in my support, certainly, for lowering the speed limit. To me, we know that speed kills. We know that if you get hit at 40 kilometers an hour, you've got a maybe 80% chance of survival. If you get hit at 60 kilometers an hour, you have a 20% chance of survival. And that's something that municipalities can look at, and certainly they can couple that with where their injuries are happening or crashes are happening. From a pedestrian point of view, right-hand turns are a problem, right? People end up getting hit with a right hook because just the dynamics of a car turning right, they often don't see what's happening. And left-hand turns can T-bone cars, and that can be catastrophic. So where you have an opportunity to look at an intersection and there's the potential for significant change. Roundabouts have been shown to dramatically reduce the potential for that kind of a T-bone catastrophic collision. So there are low-hanging fruits, but my favorite one is reducing the speed limit.
And I've had municipalities that have done that. They've had a road where they've had, 3 or 4 what we call near misses. And they've said, you know what, we don't know what to do. We can't redo this road. We don't have the money. We've had our road expert go out and take a look at the road. It can be as simple as reducing the speed limit on a dangerous stretch of road, a road where maybe you've had some near misses or there's been some collisions. Maybe there hasn't been a claim or a lawsuit or anything, but your staff, your roads crew would probably know exactly where those areas are.
In addition to the speed limit, you might look at road diets where you reduce the width of lanes, the number of lanes. You could give over some potentially to cycling infrastructure. It's particularly nice if you put in posts. But when you have, you can have signage saying slow down, but you also need visual cues like narrower lanes to say we mean it.
If I can add to that, just through my experience, what I've found is there's an awful lot of attention, and this is, the road safety industry has been, I would consider modern road safety in North America has been really moving well in the last 2 decades. And they have been looking very closely at engineering solutions to ensure that those that locations are modified where there are problems, that sort of thing. My perspective on Vision Zero is there needs to be a view from an overarching level, so that you're taking in that information, you're understanding what's happening throughout your system, so that you can identify solutions. They may not be location specific, they may be overarching problems that are occurring. So to take your example of the left turn vehicles or the right turn vehicles at intersections, one of the research projects that I did reviewed a municipality and reviewed all of the problems, or all of the information that we had was collision report information. We were able to look at all of the data on collision reports. The only other real information that we had was media information, so news articles and that sort of thing. But we were reviewing these, and we did find, just even with that data, that there was a high incidence of left-turning vehicles during a permissive phase, which just means you're waiting for the vehicle, your oncoming traffic, a gap in oncoming traffic to make a left turn, and those left turners hitting pedestrians that were crossing, because you're prioritizing making the left turn over the pedestrian making the crossing action. And so that actually represented in this study, and it was an urban municipality, but it was upwards of 20% of the deaths that were happening every year. So if you were to try and identify that in a locational basis, you would say, well, that hasn't happened at that intersection. That only happened once at that intersection. But if you look at it as an overarching systemic problem, you can come up with solutions that may be very simple. Again, coming back to that, cost-saving measure, really all that is tweaking the signal timing. You could altogether remove a permissive phase. That's one thing. You'll sacrifice other things, but you can also add leading pedestrian phases, which the City of Toronto has been doing quite dutifully lately. You can modify the intersection. You can modify the medians to actually increase the arc and lower the speed. Again, to say the speed does have a big factor. In that study, actually, the right turning vehicles were represented, but they were to a lesser extent because the speed's lower. As you're making the left turn, you're coming in at a higher speed. So, yeah.
I think one of the other things that is cost effective is education. I believe it was New York, and you gentlemen can correct me if I'm wrong, that for the city employees, they put in a wide-arching requirement for defensive driving, and that had an impact on their Vision Zero initiative. So have your drivers had defensive driving seminars or courses? I think that's something we could all use refreshers on every few years.
Just one last point on that, the visual cues that were mentioned, certainly on rural roads and long roads with, you're driving for many hours and you're coming into, a community and you need to slow down. I think visual cues are very key there in the rural roads as well. Signs on both sides of the road. It's quite common in Europe, and it's very, very effective. A truck might be blocking that sign, but you see the one on the other side. Or a snowplow has plastered the one that you're supposed to look at, but you can still see the one on the other side because the snowplow hasn't plastered it. So there's those kind of things too, the visual cues, something on the road, something that we see that changes our focus on what we've just been driving for hours, and now we need to change focus because we have to slow down. So I think that's important too. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so there's a very clear public health aspect to Vision Zero, as we've seen. But is there anything else beyond the obvious, namely the reduction of fatalities and injuries that should be considered? Do you want to start us off on that one, Charles?
Yeah. So, that's probably my favorite of your questions. And I touched on it to some degree in my presentation at the beginning, and that is that although injuries are certainly important to prevent, if you make it safe for pedestrians and cyclists and inviting for them, you'll get a lot more of it. You'll have an additional reduction in traffic that then improves safety for everybody. But on top of that, you're going to have an even bigger measurable effect on chronic disease. The health effect is actually greater from the prevention of chronic disease than the injuries themselves.
Anyone else have anything to add there, or? No? Okay. So, here at OGRA, especially at this conference, we like to talk about things that could be applicable to both urban and rural municipalities, because we are a province-wide association. So my next question is, can Vision Zero be applied in both rural and urban settings? Because we always hear a lot about the urban side of things, but can it be applied in both settings?
I'll start with that in the sense that that's certainly what our project's looking at. We're a very rural area, rural and northern area, and certainly there are a significant number of Vision Zero principles that we can apply in rural settings, and also in the small towns and villages as well. So I'm going to say yes to that, and I think the 2+1 road model is a clear example of that.
This is why I keep sort of harping on we need to look at the data, and the other component of that is the data differs. The jurisdictions are so different. A rural area versus an urban area, a municipality, every one of them is very unique in their own way. So you look at a rural community, you may consider a rural community to be, outside of a major city, or you may consider, that to be more far afield. And so there is a need to look at that data and understand that your jurisdiction has a very unique data set that should be reviewed.
And I think that if you're thinking about, whether, do I need to review my data from an insurance perspective, I can tell you that a catastrophic accident can happen on a rural road, it can happen on a city road, it can happen on any road. So there is no one that is immune to these catastrophic injuries and accidents on our road, which means to me that Vision Zero is applicable to any size municipality.
From a public health point of view, we know that rural communities are at a higher risk. They have higher rates of road death than urban environments. And that would be for two reasons. They're more, by their nature, car dependent. People get a lot more exposure to driving, and it's at highway speeds, which are much more devastating when they have a crash. They tend to involve drivers much more than pedestrians because of the environment. And so surely they deserve attention, looking at what can you do to help reduce their burden of injury as well, considering that they're at a higher risk.
What does the provincial government need to do to support municipalities in moving towards Vision Zero?
From my perspective, I think it's just making data available and making it easily accessible. So getting all of those data sources. So, there are collision reports, but there are many other reports that are associated specifically with fatal injury or fatal collisions, but as well as severe injury collisions. So taking that and allowing municipalities to review that information would be primary, I think.
I would agree. Any information you can get, whether it's from the government, your insurer, the OPP, whoever it is, getting that information, I think is a great first step to start your Vision Zero initiative.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with the statistics part. It's certainly something that, as we've been researching our project, that sometimes it's difficult to get, and it's difficult to get the various groups sort of together on collecting those stats. I would also say that it would be great if we could adopt it as a province, the principle of Vision Zero that Scott was talking about earlier. I think that's an important first step for sure. Yeah.
I would agree with all that I've heard. Making it a priority, a provincial priority, make the province a Vision Zero community, I think would be excellent. You have to use data, making a data available, maybe a periodic report on the safety of highways. It breaks it down by region, potentially. They could also enable communities to reduce their speed limits. And they could enable secondary highways to be divided. Right? Those are key things that they could do.
So we do have the Ontario Road Safety Report, which does divide, into regions, but sometimes they're not quite local enough, right? So as you said, Adam, every community is different. So they're general and regional, but sometimes we need a little bit more information from sort of our local authorities on that side of it. So the road safety report that Ontario puts out is excellent. It's got good data. It could be a little more. I guess we need to sort of focus a little more on some of the local areas and have that ability to get that information. Yeah.
Just no more on that, to think about the legislation, the supporting legislation. So for instance, we've just, we've passed a bill for automated speed enforcement in Ontario, which really is just a change to the Highway Traffic Act that allows municipalities to implement automated speed enforcement in specific areas. And so, that wouldn't be possible without support from the provincial government to implement.
Are there any jurisdictions that any of you would point to as having successfully adopted Vision Zero, and what does a Made in Ontario plan look like?
I can try that.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
I think, from reviewing all of the programs that are in North America, that are in Europe, safe systems programs that are in New Zealand, I would say, you almost need to go outside of North America to find, sort of true sort of Vision Zero plans. New York City, for instance, has done a very good job, and they've brought down their road deaths. But if you were to actually look at where they started, they had a long way to go. And so they're making a lot of these changes that are occurring, but a lot of it, is it necessarily evidence-based? So in the case of Sweden, yeah, it was taken on from that perspective. It was actually top-down, to sort of go back to that last question about the provincial government and what role would they play. The way that Sweden rolled theirs out was actually a national initiative. So it was from the top down. It wasn't municipalities taking it up on their own. But yeah, if I were to look at jurisdictions that had successful programs, I would certainly say New Zealand, Australia, Sweden, Norway. Most of the sort of Nordic countries have undertaken good programs. But the problem is how transferable is that here? And so really, my perspective is we're kind of on our own to come up with the thing that works for Ontario, that works within our own municipalities, because we're very unique.
I am aware of certain communities that are working closely with public health and other stakeholders, police and others, towards Vision Zero. So London and Hamilton and Toronto and Ottawa and Peel region are communities I have heard of from my colleagues that have made it a priority, moved in that direction, made some progress. But a lot of progress is needed, obviously.
Just a quick comment on other jurisdictions, and I won't repeat the ones that Adam mentioned, but I mentioned I was in Lithuania in December, and the Baltic states had an atrocious road fatality record, and they have partnered with Sweden and Norway to make some changes, and they've made some very significant changes by adopting Vision Zero. And again, they've looked at their own environment. And so how does it look in Ontario? Well, yeah, we have to assess the environment, and also, I think the adoption of it is the first step, and that's how does it look in Ontario? Your question is, it's a little difficult, I think, at this point. We have to sort of embrace it and then see how it's going to play out. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have time for probably one more question, and I think this is fitting as I think Mike Schreiner, I think I saw him back there. What do you think is preventing political leaders from adopting it? And if you could maybe advise one of the provincial leaders on Vision Zero, what would you tell them? Nobody wants to touch that one.
It's a priority.
Yeah.
It should be a priority. I know that they're very busy people, and there's a lot of distraction, a lot on their plate to deal with. But these are real people whose lives are immediately cut short, and it's so common that everybody knows somebody who's affected in some way.
I think we've mentioned some of the points already in the sense of the cost. There's often that impression, well, how much is that going to cost? It's going to cost too much. But we've already talked about the economic impact, and your stats have been have clearly show that. And I think we have to look at it from the other perspective, which is what Vision Zero did originally, right? It kind of looked at road safety from another angle, and you can see obviously the human benefits, but you can also see the economic benefits. And yeah, it's very difficult for leaders who are trying to balance that. But there is definitely a return for that. And I think that's key, that we have to keep that in mind. Yeah.
And when thinking about the ask, if you have information, it makes it easier to ask. If someone's asking me for something, I'm going to want to understand what the conditions are, what's the benefit, and if you can provide that information through evidence-based research, right. that information is something that is going to have a reasonably large impact on road safety deaths. It makes that ask easier. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. And any final take-home messages for our municipal decision makers here?
Look for opportunities.
Yeah.
Commit to it and look for opportunities. We've touched on many examples of opportunities.
Sure. Yeah. There's some easy wins. Vision Zero is a transformative initiative, and it has significant returns. And I think we need to look at that. Yeah.
I would tell everyone that, you're not alone. Let's work together. Work with your insurer. Work with organizations like OGRA. You don't have to be on your own to do this. Look to your partner communities. See if there's initiatives that you can undertake together.
I would say that a strong Vision Zero program looks specifically at fatal and severe injury collisions and does a root cause analysis on those.
All right, well, we are out of time. So thank you very much for being here this afternoon and for speaking to our audience. And that concludes this panel. Thank you very much, everybody.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure at this time to introduce our next speaker. Mike Schreiner is the leader of the Green Party of Ontario and the MPP for Guelph, the first ever Green MPP elected to the Ontario Legislature. He was elected in the 2018 provincial election with a resounding 45% of the vote. Mike was elected leader of the Green Party of Ontario on November 14, 2009, and under his leadership, the Green Party has experienced substantial growth in its voters, fundraising, staff, volunteers, and media exposure, reaching its highest support levels in the 2018 election. Please join me now in welcoming back to the OGRA stage, Mike Schreiner.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you for that kind introduction. Appreciate it. Thank you all for being here today. It's a real honor to join you and to be back with the Ontario Good Roads Association. And I just want to take a moment before I begin my talk today to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of many Indigenous peoples, in particular the Seneca, the Huron-Wendat, and most recently the Mississaugas of the New Credit. And I can tell you that in every decision I make at Queen's Park, I'm always thinking about how this decision will affect the next 7 generations. Because I fundamentally believe in government, we need more long-term thinking. And I know that is something that the Ontario Good Roads Association takes seriously. It's something I know you've been advocating for, particularly when it comes to funding. And so I want you to know that when it comes to my office and the Green Party of Ontario, you have a partner in thinking about the long-term decisions we need to make. And I want to thank you for the advocacy you've done for municipalities, public works, public infrastructure over the last 125 years. It's truly a remarkable accomplishment and an essential advocacy role for our communities and for our province, so thank you. So I believe that one of the biggest challenges we are facing in Ontario is how do we build our communities, how do we maintain infrastructure, and how do we ensure prosperity for the long term in a rapidly changing world. The need to mitigate and adapt to a changing climate at a time when governments face fiscal constraints and an infrastructure repair backlog that I know this organization is well aware of is a huge challenge. And the only way we're going to tackle that challenge is to have an honest conversation about how do we design solutions that put people and communities first, and how do we design solutions that not only work for us today, but ensure a livable future for our children, our grandchildren, in the next 7 generations. And I want to be very clear that I don't believe the province can meet that challenge by putting it on the backs of municipal property taxpayers alone. That we need to partner with municipal governments. I know municipal governments are constantly being asked to do more with less. And while citizens should expect that municipalities fund and deliver services efficiently, maintain infrastructure responsibly, they also need to know that the province is willing to step up to the table. And so that's why we need the provincial government to step up with predictable, stable, long-term funding, especially for infrastructure. As a start, I'm calling on this government to not cut funding for the Ontario Municipal Partnership Fund in the upcoming provincial budget. And I'm calling on this government to use its first budget to provide predictable, stable, long-term multi-year funding for infrastructure so that municipalities can plan. They can budget properly and budget responsibly, because we know that good long-term planning is equal to making sure we manage our assets in a fiscally responsible way. And the two go hand in hand. So if the government is going to call for responsible fiscal management, it needs to deliver the tools and the funding so municipalities can deliver responsible fiscal management. Shortchanging municipalities is not the way to build communities that people want to live in, want to raise their children and their families in, nor is it the way to attract businesses to invest and create jobs in our communities. To put this in language that I hope the Premier will understand, is there's only one taxpayer in Ontario, and citizens will get the most bang for their buck if we provide municipalities with the tools and supports they need to be world leaders in asset management, infrastructure planning, and the stewardship of public resources. And so that's why I've supported OGRA's call to standardize the measurement of assets across the province and to provide a predictable budget commitment for dedicated funding for municipal infrastructure. We want to work with you. The Green Party wants to work with you to make sure those infrastructure investments are the right ones for the 21st century. That we make the kinds of investments that reflect the reality of the world we live in today and help us be resilient in the face of a changing climate. We know that last year alone, extreme weather events caused by climate change cost this province alone $1.2 billion in insurable losses. And that doesn't even count the uninsured losses due to extreme weather events. According to the Environment Commissioner of Ontario, in the first 6 months of last year alone, extreme weather events cost the average household in this province $350. So we were on track. We haven't got the final numbers in, but we were on track for extreme weather events almost costing every household in this province $700 last year. And we know, according to the Insurance Bureau of Canada, that those costs are only going to increase. And I tell you, being from Guelph today is a perfect example of that. I don't think I've ever heard of a day when every single road in Wellington County was closed this morning. And I can tell you, given the extreme fluctuations in temperatures we've had over the last month, that I'm sure all of you are facing complaints from your residents for potholes, potholes, potholes. And I can tell you, whether you're a cyclist, a driver, or a transit user, we want good roads. And it is tough to deliver on that when you see the extremes in temperatures we've been facing. And that's becoming, unfortunately, the new normal. And so we have to invest in the right infrastructure. And as we invest in that infrastructure, we need to ensure that we protect nature's ability to provide services to us for free. You know, one of the biggest challenges we face is flooding. And one of the reasons flooding is getting worse is not only because of extreme weather events, but also because we're starting to pave over more and more of the green space. The earth would normally absorb that water and do it for free. And so I would argue that if we're going to, in a fiscally responsible way, manage our infrastructure assets, particularly when it comes to stormwater management and flood mitigation, is we have to protect the earth's ability to absorb that excess water for free. That is the fiscally responsible approach. It is the approach that I will take, and it's one of the reasons we fought so hard to remove Schedule 10 from Bill 66, because I don't believe protecting the Greenbelt, protecting green space, protecting our waterways and our clean drinking water is red tape. It's essential to life. And you know, I want to compliment the government, and it's not very often you hear an opposition party do this, for removing Schedule 10 from Bill 66. Because not only is it about protecting our communities and our infrastructure, but it's also protecting the farmland that provides such a vital asset base for our economy. You know, over 800,000 people work in the food and farming sector, contributing over $40 billion to Ontario's economy. And I have no idea why any government would want to pave over it. the asset base that generates all that wealth. And so we need to ensure that we develop our infrastructure using the right infrastructure and putting it in the right places, and also recognizing that green infrastructure provides essential and vital services. Over $3.2 billion in the Greenbelt alone that we want to protect. And so we know that we can develop our transportation systems. We know that we can address housing affordability and provide employment lands without paving over the places we love in this province. And as we think about the infrastructure we're going to build for the 21st century, I also believe it's critically important to build infrastructure that's going to lead to the communities that we envision. And it was so nice to come right after a panel on Vision Zero and to talk about how important it is to build roads and streets and communities and cities, whether it's urban or rural, that provide infrastructure that make it safe for all users. Whether you're a cyclist, you're a pedestrian, you have a wheeled mobility device, you're a transit user, or you're a driver. And I'm all of those except for the wheeled mobility device. It's essential that we have infrastructure that accommodates all those road users. And so sometimes I'm asked, well, why don't we have more cycling and walking infrastructure in particular? And part of the challenge is that you know how much of the provincial budget is dedicated, the transportation budget is dedicated to walking and cycling? Zero. We got a little bit of cap and trade money from municipalities, but we still, in 2019, have nothing dedicated to walking and cycling infrastructure in our provincial budget, and I believe that has to change. We have to invest more in transit. We have to help people get out of their cars and into alternatives. And we know that we need electrified all-the-way two-way GO services. We know we need to build a relief line in Toronto. We know we need to expand transit out into the greater Toronto, Hamilton area. We know that we need to bring rail service back to Northern Ontario. We have to give people options. And for those who still need to drive their personal vehicle, we need to build out electric vehicle infrastructure, because we know that the #1 source of greenhouse gas pollution in this province is our transportation sector. But it's not just about addressing climate change, it's about embracing a 21st century economy that's going to create jobs and prosperity. We know that the auto sector is spending $255 billion between now and 2023 on electric vehicle and low-emission vehicle research and development. Many countries, and particularly in Europe, have plans to phase out internal combustion engines by 2030 or 2040. We know where the world is going. And we as Ontarians need to skate to where the puck is going, not where it has been. We have to invest in the jobs of the 21st century. The clean economy is a $7 trillion a year economic opportunity. And I want Ontario to lead that economic transformation, because I think it's essential and vital for creating the jobs of the 21st century, generating wealth and prosperity in our communities, so we have the resources. There's a little bit of little background noise there. Sorry about that. We have to have for us to be successful in the 21st century, we have to invest in the jobs of the 21st century to generate the prosperity we need. Wow. To generate the prosperity we need to have the resources to invest in our communities. Because I believe it's absolutely essential that we have the resources, the financial resources, to invest in good public services. And I just want to close by talking about the provincial budget, which I know this government's first budget is coming up. And I believe fundamentally that we cannot cut our way to prosperity. while at the same time we have to make sure we have a balanced approach to the province's finances. And as far as I know, we're the only political party that is willing to stand here and have an honest conversation with the people of Ontario about ways in which we can save money, so we can help municipalities save money through tort reform, joint and several liability reform, for example. We can help the province save money by getting rid of the unfair hydro plan, which is costing this province $4.5 billion a year. $4.5 billion to take 25% off people's electricity bills. We should be investing that in helping the people who need the help the most, and also making sure we have money for education, healthcare, and other essential public services, infrastructure, transit, and transportation. But we also have to look at ways that we can raise additional revenue. And the FAO report 2 weeks ago showed that Ontario has the lowest per capita rate of return on natural resource wealth of any province in Canada. So even if we increased our resource wealth to the same level of Saskatchewan's, we could bring in almost an additional $1 billion a year. So we can have a responsible and balanced approach to ensure that we have the resources we need. And we're willing to have a conversation with municipalities to have the same kinds of revenue tools that places like Toronto have. We want to pull the rug out from under a municipal leader who has the courage to say, you know, maybe we have to have road pricing to fund transit. Maybe we have to think outside the box, to think about new ways of generating revenue that doesn't put the burden on the backs of property taxpayers, which is the most regressive form of taxation, and doesn't put the burden on the backs of people with modest and middle incomes. And so as I think about where this province is headed, I think now more than ever, we need to have an honest and frank conversation. Politicians, the public, staff, municipal staff, about the ways in which we can raise money and save money, because we have to make those long-term investments. We have to tackle big challenges like climate change, because Ontarians are problem solvers, not problem deniers. But the only way we're going to be able to do that is to have a frank and honest conversation about the challenges we face and the solutions that we can deliver for people. And I know this is the kind of organization, OGRA, that wants to have those kinds of conversations. It's having those kinds of conversations with government. And I look forward to working with you. I look forward to partnering with you so we can make the investments we need in Ontario to build wonderful, wonderful, inclusive, connected communities that provide a sustainable and livable future for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you so much for your great work. Thank you so much for being here today. It's a pleasure to spend time with you this afternoon.
Just wait out. Thank you very much, Mike Schreiner. Very well topic, and thank you for acknowledging all the good work that OGRA has been doing on asset management and getting to know where our infrastructure is at. So again, thank you very much. Thank you. Our next speaker, Minister of Transportation, will be arriving very shortly, so just hang tight. Thank you. And actually, our next speaker that was supposed to be here, because of the weather, the roads are closed, so she couldn't make it. So she sends her apologies.